All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It is the last session of our Gather and Grow online conference day of event. So we're going to try to be as upbeat and positive as possible, even though we're presenting on library and library material challenges. Um, and quite frankly, I think this is a conversation or a discussion that Eric and I both look forward to discussing. We offered a program back in the summer just following the Allegheny County Directors Association meeting on policy development. And we touched upon the topic of collection management policies, library material challenges, as well as social media policy. And it was during that session we really learned that the membership was wanting to hear more about within a live setting or a conversation type setting about library material challenges and how all the stakeholders within the system kind of deal with that, because it is a multi-stakeholder situation. It's not just a patron, it's not just a staff member, it's not just a director, and it's not just a board member. It's the entire community and how we come together to deal with how either an individual within the community or a group within the community challenges what the library is actually doing. And the other thing I think is important that we stress before we get started is you'll notice in the title of our discussion today is it's library and library material challenges. And we're really specific about this because it's not just library materials that are being challenged across our nation right now at an escalating rate. And it's not just materials that are being banned by some boards or some school districts within our nation right now. It's the overall challenge of how libraries are delivering services. And so I think it's important that we dig a little bit more into what's taking place at libraries. So not only are we prepared when a community member or a group of the community comes forward and says, hey, we don't necessarily like the books that you have on your shelves or the displays that you have within your library, we're best prepared to deal with situations where um, uh, all library services, when they are challenged, whether it is a program or a service of outreach or just even the types of technologies that we offer, not everybody is going to be in complete agreement of what it is that we're actually doing. So that is our hope for today's program within the next 40 plus minutes, is to try to give us a better understanding of how we deal with these things as they're presented to us. And I want to thank Erika Jens, who's our engagement consultant here at STLS, for joining me again today. We've been doing several professional development presentations together as system consultants, so it's always good to be presenting with her as well. Um, so what I'd like to do right now is I'd actually like to open it up for discussion, because this is kind of like the unconference track. And so just by all of you, if you could take an opportunity, you have the ability to raise your hand down at the lower left part of your screen. I'd be interested in hearing from you as a group. Why do we prepare for library or library material challenges? And if you don't feel comfortable sharing vocally, if you wouldn't mind just sharing within the chat. And actually, we'll just make that an exercise. If you wouldn't mind just sharing in the chat why you believe we need to prepare for library material challenges. And you can just use a couple words. Michelle says they'll happen sooner or later to all libraries. Absolutely, Michelle. For consistent messaging between directors and boards. So we know how to respond when it does occur. That's what Kim said, and Wilsenia was the one that said for consistent messaging. Kelly says, not seeing the hand raise in the corner this time, so everybody is on the same page in the event of a challenge. Yep. So directors will be prepared and be available to answer questions correctly and calmly. It is always just a good idea to be prepared. Thank you, Linda. And Jackie says, because our world is dynamic and we didn't need to make supporting all our patrons part of our mission early on. Okay, we're gonna build off those. Thank you very much for sharing, everybody. I really appreciate it. And we do have some answers too that we'd like to provide, and pretty much everybody that is here with us right now is absolutely right on. So First and foremost, we just want to empower staff, directors, and trustees, and even volunteers to be able to respond with a certain level of confidence. I can recall probably the very first time that I received my first request for reconsideration form. I was working at a circulation desk at an academic library. A community member came in and they were upset about a material that they had found on the shelf. And so when they came in, they were very upset about it, first and foremost. But what was unfortunate was I did not know how to deal with the situation because, first of all, it was the first time I had ever had somebody come to me with this concern. Second of all, I didn't have access to the form, so I didn't know like what it was that they were talking about at all. I hadn't received that type of training yet. And so I did the best that I could with that situation. I did what, the ALA recommends. I wrote down the patron's concern. I took their contact information and I said that I would respond to them within the next 24 hours so that I could provide them access to a form that they would be able to fill out. And, this was over 20 plus years ago when I was working in an academic library. I had no formal librarian training whatsoever. And I was really just, I was working as a student assistant on the front lines. And so in that moment, had I received some type of training from my department head or from administration that other staff members had received, I would have been better prepared to deal with that situation. And quite frankly, I'm not really sure what happened with that request for reconsideration. I provided the information to my supervisor, and obviously, the head of access services reached out to that patron, and I'm sure it got dealt with in the proper way per policy. But in that moment in time, I felt really uncomfortable in my position as a staff member because I just didn't know how to deal with it. And the same could be said for directors and trustees because it is the director's responsibility to review and consider those requests for reconsideration of library materials, and then also act upon them and communicate with the patron as well as putting their trustees on notice. So just empowering staff and directors and trustees is first and foremost. The second thing is, which I believe one of you mentioned, was just maintaining consistency from one challenge to the next. If we truly want to provide equitable services to all the community members that we serve, regardless of their partisanship or their opinions in life or where they come from, it is important that when they do submit any type of reconsideration of library materials or reconsideration of library services, that they're being treated in a very consistent manner. Even though probably what's going to happen with the decision-making process on the administrative level in terms of making sure that that material still stays within the library or that service or that display still continues on within the library, we make certain that the messaging and the way that we treat that patron is consistent from one patron to the next. And then also strengthening library practices and public perceptions of the institution. It's part of my job and a role as a system director is to make sure all libraries are rising up together at the same exact time, and that doesn't all happen at the same exact time. All of our libraries are very unique. It's one of the greatest strengths of our cooperative library system, but there are times where some libraries are a little bit further ahead in terms of the types of practices or things that they're doing. But through this training and through us just having this discussion, hopefully we're bringing all of our libraries up together where we're strengthening our practices so that regardless of what library I enter into across the 5-county area, I know that one, I'm going to be receiving the same type of service or an equitable service. But at the same time, I know that every administrator within that building is going to hold the line when it comes to the types of materials that we keep within our shelves and the types of services or displays or outreach or programs that we offer are upheld because we want to make sure that we maintain our library bill of rights, protect intellectual freedoms. Okay. So that's a little bit about just why it's important, just important about why we prepare for library and library material challenges. Um, Now what we'd like to do is take a little bit of time to talk through the stakeholders that are involved in library and library material challenges, as well as the different types of essential tools that are available to us. And really what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 4 or 5 tools that are absolutely essential. When I talked about that request for reconsideration form that wasn't available to me, or the training that wasn't available to me so that I can answer questions of that patron that wanted to submit that request, had those tools been in place, I would have been better prepared to not only uphold the values of an institution, but to make sure that I'm providing consistent service from one patron to the next when they put forward that request for reconsideration of library materials. Um, So, but getting back to stakeholders in this process of challenges to library and library materials, these are the folks. So it's all of us, it's our entire community. And we want to spend a little bit of time talking about these individuals and the roles that they play in this process. Um, because it is absolutely important that we have this discussion. It's not only important that we're having this discussion now as part of, some system-wide conference that's taking place on a Friday afternoon, but it's also important that when you guys leave here today, regardless of your job description or the role that you play in your library, you're going back and having the same exact discussion with your staff. And it doesn't have to be something that's absolutely like formal or like, hey, we're going to have this meeting on this date and time, and we need to talk about how we deal with library material challenges or just overall challenges to how the library offers services. It can be side conversations between directors and frontline staff, just saying, hey, where's that request for reconsideration of library materials form? Or have we looked at our collection materials policy? Or the director going into the next library board meeting and saying, hey, we haven't reviewed our collection management policy. We also haven't reviewed our library materials challenges policy in the last 5 years. We haven't looked at it. And quite frankly, I'm a little bit concerned because we may have community members that want to exercise that right in the coming days, weeks, months, or year. It's like Michelle said, it is going to happen. It's not a question of like whether or not it's going to happen. It's going to just be a question of when is it going to happen. So first and foremost, we have our patrons. Those are the individuals that are using our collection. They're observing library services, both inside of the library as well as outside of the library. And, they're making determinations or opinions on whether or not they agree with how you're approaching collection management or how you're providing services. And so um, within this process, they have the right to file a request for reconsideration, or it might be a group. Okay. Um, the other folks that are involved in this process is frontline staff. So I recognize that 2/3 of our libraries are part-time libraries. They have one paid staff person or maybe two or three paid staff persons. And then they also have volunteers. Regardless of who is a paid individual within your library, everybody that is on payroll needs to have some type of training and some understanding about the collection management policy. They need to have understanding about what the request for reconsideration for library materials policy is and where it's located within the library. And then also they need to know, like I gave you my previous example, the request for library materials form, a request for reconsideration of library materials form. They need to know where that is located behind the circulation desk, whether it's a staff member or volunteer, because when a community member comes in, they don't care whether that's a paid staff person or whether that's a volunteer or if that's the director. They want to be heard. So they want to be able to voice their opinion about what is in your library or what your library is offering. And there's great procedures offered by the American Library Association, and we'll highlight some of those resources a little bit later on in terms of how staff can appropriately handle those types of conversations. And then we have the director, and that's probably many of you that are on this meeting right now. So making sure that you're the person that's doing this, like you've got the balancing act. So you need to not only make sure that the policies and the forms and the tools we're going to talk about in a minute are in place, but you also have a responsibility that the training is taking place. You have a responsibility to make sure that discussions are taking place between you and the board so that the board is not only developing those policies and tools that we're going to talk about, um, they're also upholding those policies and they understand them and they know what their role is when they become not only the second line of defense, but the last line of defense when it comes to a reconsideration of library materials or just overall service. Okay, so that's the director's responsibility or role as a stakeholder. And then lastly, I know we have trustees here, and I think that's fantastic. Thank you very much for being here today because you are the second line of defense in our rural libraries. And then you are also the last line of reconsideration. We're going to highlight some case studies that have taken place, unfortunately have taken place a lot in the last year, and then also some that have taken place within our state where trustees didn't necessarily hold that line the way that they should have. Fortunately, they've reconsidered how they did not hold that line, and they went back and upheld our Library Bill of Rights and intellectual freedoms through their decision making. But here's the point that I'm trying to make is why it's so important for trustees to know what their role is. everybody else is watching. And that is our next stakeholder and our last stakeholder. That's community. So conscientious observers. And what I like to do is just take you back to this last line that I put up. The last bullet point on the slide says, the reason why we prepare for library and library material challenges is because we want to preserve national democratic processes. Libraries are an American value. The one thing that I've learned through my observations, my research, and also working with all of you, we live in a region where 65% of our residents are Republican, 34% of our residents are Democrat, and about 1% are independent or unidentified. What I can tell you is, although we haven't done this research, about 50% of our boards are Republican and 50% of our boards are Democrats. Let's put that aside for a minute. I just want to share that with you from like a standpoint of understanding that this isn't so much a partisan issue. This is about upholding our Library Bill of Rights. And I can assure you, just through the work that I've done, regardless of partisan beliefs or partisan affiliations, people that serve on library boards, as long as they understand and subscribe to the Library Bill of Rights, they understand the importance of First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, and intellectual freedoms. And this is where this last bullet point comes into play, which is community, conscientious observers. Even if for some reason your library, Board of Trustees, as the second and last line of defense when it comes to reconsideration, upholds and maintains a book within the collection that many of your people within your or do support, who do not want to see that in their, I assure you, as a conscientious observer, regardless of their partisan beliefs, they will respect your decision making. Because the next time that there's a book on the shelf that they do want to see within that collection, and they do believe is important to have within that collection, they do believe is a First Amendment right to have shared with other people within the community, they will respect your decision making because you did the right thing the first time, and they have trust in you that you will make that on that second time you make that decision, when it's the book they'd like to see in their collection, will trust that you will keep it to uphold our American values, particularly our First Amendment rights. Okay. With everything that we've shared so far, does anybody have any questions about anything that's been shared so far on the stakeholder stuff, or why we even make sure that we're familiar with these processes? And you can enter it into the chat, that's fine. Okay, no questions are good. So essential tools. These are the 5 things that Erika and I presented on when we did our policy workshop back in the summer in Allegheny County. And they're the 5 things that we want to present to all of you again today. And so I'm just going to go over them quickly because we're going to dig deeper into them a little bit later on in the session. But essentially, from an essential tool standpoint, in order for our stakeholders, our staff, our director, our trustees, those 3 folks that are internally within the library, in order for them to uphold our Library Bill of Rights and our intellectual freedoms and our First Amendment rights as American citizens and American value, it is important that these tools are in place. And I emphasize the importance of this because I work with a lot of our libraries. And, you know, sometimes when I go out and Eric and I both go out and we do our duties and responsibilities training, a lot of our trustees are really engaged and they're really with it and they want to hear what we have to say. We did a great session last night up at Wayland Library, and Hope Decker, your trustees are awesome. But there are times where I know we aren't all meeting the minimum standards in terms of policy development. We don't have all of the policies in place that we're supposed to have, or the policies that we have in place aren't current, or the policies in place haven't been reviewed or even read by trustees that are elected or appointed to the board since they've even been on the board. And so it is absolutely important that not only directors understand these policies and are reviewing them and working with their board to keep them up to date, but that everybody, both director and trustees on the board, have these policies in place, because it is these policies that do that thing that I mentioned early on: empower staff, directors, and trustees to respond with confidence. Okay, these are the absolute tools that are needed. So Eric and I are gonna dig a little bit deeper into these policies in just a little bit, but we just wanted to put it out there. So you have your collection management policy, and yeah, I'll define it right now. So our collection management policy is the policy that objectively states a transparent document, a transparent public document that's made available to everybody. You should have a copy of it behind your circulation desk. Quite frankly, the best policy is to have a policy manual that's up to date and it's actually cataloged on the shelf somewhere in the library. You can do that. There's a record for it in the ILS. And you should have your policy manual either available to the public through your catalog. You should also have those documents up on your website. Complete disclosure, complete transparency, and complete and total access for everybody. And then, so you should have your collection management policy, which defines objectively how it is that you guys add materials to your collections. And then you have your challenge to library materials policy, which does not need to be comprehensive. It basically states the steps that you take, the stakeholders that we just mentioned, using the tools that we're talking about right now, the steps you take when somebody puts forward that request for reconsideration of library materials, who's involved in the process, who's in charge or charged with making the decisions, the time frame for how the decisions are made, and how you will actually respond to community members based on the decision making. And then the last two things are our social media, or I'm sorry, and then the next thing is the request for reconsideration of library material. So that's the actual form itself that sits behind the circulation desk. Everybody knows where it is, and everybody knows how to present it to a patron that has concerns, and then also listen to the patron voice those concerns, have them fill out that form with very specific detailed information about what they're contesting, why they're contesting it, and whether or not they've done their due diligence to like actually determine whether or not from their point of view or their opinion why this material or this service should not be on the shelf or offered by the library. Okay, and then the next two essential tools are your social media policy and public communications policy. And so I'll just say this briefly because we're going to talk about it a little bit more in a moment. But social media policy and public communications policy, the reason why we've included these two documents in this presentation or part of this discussion today is they're absolutely essential. We have not seen, or we are not experiencing the level of requests for reconsideration of library materials or library services in our system that other libraries or other regions are experiencing across New York State or the nation. And I'm not saying that we're immune to it or people aren't concerned. I'm also saying that that stuff is, it's that specific thing is not happening. What we are seeing that's happening is there are discussions that are taking place between boards and directors. There are a small number or a sliver of board members that are not necessarily in agreement with how we uphold our collection management policies or what should be on the shelf or what programs should be offered. The other thing that we're seeing, which is the most unfortunate thing, is that our librarians are taking it on the chin. So whether it is harassment or bullying through social media because of the services that are being offered through the library, whether it is email communication from community members going directly to library email accounts, or whether or not it's actual communication that's taking place on social media through shared platforms or blogs or whatever you want to call them, where people are attacking the library as an institution. That stuff is happening in our region. And it is our social media policies and our public communication policies that will hopefully help you as library stakeholders address those types of things. Okay. So that's me doing a lot of talking, and I look forward to the fact that Erika is going to start working with me on some of this presentation share out. But what we would like to do is, and I know this might be difficult for all of you to share this information, but is there anything right now that's taking place in the system that you guys would like to share that you're dealing with locally within your libraries? And before I stop talking, I'll just say it's all important information to us. We're all learning through this process. And, sometimes for us that work here at the system, we're at an advantage because we hear about everything that's going on. Where when you're only working at a library, you're only dealing with what's going on in your library, or you have some of those networks outside of your library that you hear about, but it's not as large of a scope. So I know it's hard to do it through chat, but I would be interested in knowing if there's anybody within today's discussion or presentation that would be willing to share any of the challenges that you're facing around any of the topics that we're talking about today. Excellent. So yes, and placing it in chat is completely fine. So I'm going to read Kelly's first, and I'm good with awkward pauses. So that's why I'm waiting for you guys to write stuff in chat. So Kelly writes, I've been incorporating more controversial materials into our children's collection. I haven't had anything but positive feedback, but I do expect there will be challenges at some point in the future, mostly regarding materials that focus on gender identity and pronouns, etc. Thanks for sharing, Kelly. Yes, Maggie, if you wouldn't mind sharing something from a long time ago, we would be good with that.
Hi, I'm the PK-12 librarian at Watkins and also a trustee. And I love what Kelly just wrote. I'm glad she's doing that because I'm doing that too in the school district. But my first year as a school librarian, I had a challenge, and the challenge was Frog and Toad are friends. And the parent called me and said, I object to the wording in this book. And I said, well, what's the word? Poop, poop. The car horn goes poop, poop. And she objected to that. So I was able to send her the material to do the challenge. And what was really ridiculous was her children were not of reading age. So she could have read honk, honk, toot, toot, anything but that. The book stayed on the shelf and she never filled out the paperwork.
Thank you for sharing, Maggie. We appreciate it.
I think it shows how ridiculous some of this could be, especially now with our LGBT, TQ transgender stuff going on. If you're going to object to Frog and Toad are friends, wow, it's crazy what people are objecting to now.
Yeah, and I think, well, the one thing that I would like to share in terms of like a best practice and the way that you handle that situation. So it sounds like so the community member never filled an actual form for request of reconsideration of library materials. You gave them the opportunity to vent. Like you gave them that platform to just say, hey, I'm not happy about it. I don't agree with it, and here's my reasons why. But ultimately, like nothing else moved forward from it. And like you said, the material stayed in the collection, which is the most important thing, right? So I'm going to go back to the chat here and just read a few more. Angela indicates we received harassing emails about our banned book month programming. Yeah, and quite frankly, so after Banned Book Month, that was actually when STLS started receiving inquiries from multiple member libraries within different counties, just about tough decisions or harassment or conversations that were taking place between directors and boards about how we approach our collection management policies, who has final say on what is written in the collection management policy, and then also how we go about developing our library material challenges policy. Kim writes, we had a patron object to some children's books in our collection. I am Jazz and another PB about LGBTQ families. She refuses to bring her grandchildren anymore to any of our programs or to check out materials. Thank you, Kim. When I was at Montour, we had a patron complain about John Stewart adult nonfiction book that had a photo of a naked baby, no genitalia. Linda from Corning writes, Corning too has been working on building a more diverse collection, and from a while ago I recall a father complaining about the gender versions of I think the book is How to Go Potty, because the book shows drawings of children with, well, more skin and parts showing them than he liked. He did not wish to fill out a form, but I did bring the complaint to the attention of my director. Thanks for sharing, Linda. And just one last chance to share if anybody else has anything else.
Brian, Wilsenia had her hand up. I'm not sure she still wants to share.
I missed it. Yeah. Yes, please, Wilson.
So I've had a few different challenges, none formally written, but one thing that happened that sticks out is I don't even know if you can call it a challenge, but I don't know who it was, but one of my books consistently gets placed at different parts of the library. At first I thought I was being very paranoid because I'm like, why is it the same book over and over again that I'm finding on top of shelves, behind other things? So that's been happening for a few months. So it's not really a formal complaint, but it is a complaint of sorts. And it's the first few, it's mostly the first volume of Heartstopper, but now that I've got more of the volumes of Heartstopper, it's that book, and I'm sure pretty much everybody on the call is familiar with that book because it's been so popular.
Thanks for sharing, Wilsenia. Yes, the case of the missing book or books, that is the third instance that I've heard of that within the last couple months. Jess from Montour Falls writes, we had a couple trustees leave due to conflicting views on LGBTQIA plus programming, a pride party in June, and a drag queen story time. And then Linda writes, sometimes patrons object to content by moving it or by checking it out and never returning it. Yep. West Elmira Jeffrey writes, we have held several drag story times over the last few years and received quite a bit of harassment on Facebook via phone calls to the library and emails. Yep, Jeff, and I can let you know that the case study there was actually helpful to the one that Justice mentioned up in Montour Falls. So we appreciate CCLD's courage. Yeah, that should be patrons. Thanks, Linda. And then the last one that Jackie writes, some broke my assistant's pride flag that was on their desk. And there were also, Jeff also mentions there were also staff members and volunteers who objected to the program. Okay. Thank you for sharing, everyone. Sometimes it's hard to hear those, and we hear it often here at the system. And quite frankly, like we just had this last session on stress, first aid, and coping. The difference between compassion and empathy. It's hard working at the system because we hear those stories on a more regular basis than we'd like. So I appreciate you guys putting yourself out there and sharing those stories. The other thing is, I just wanted, we're not going to spend much time on it because I want Erika to have a chance to talk through some of these policies in detail as well as myself. But I just want to make you guys aware of the fact that in 2021, ALA reported 729 attempts to ban library materials or programs or services. So it's not just books, library programs, services, displays, etc. That's quite a bit. And then as of August of 2022, ALA reported 681 attempts. I've not looked at that data since the last time that was reported in August, but I'm sure after September, we far exceeded that 729. I also just wanted to give you some case studies, and I put these out here because I wasn't sure if you guys are going to be willing or vulnerable enough to share with us today. So I just wanted them to be there so you guys can reference later. The links are on the slides that will be shared out, but please go take a look at some of these case studies. And the focus of these case studies is not so much on library material challenges, but more on how community members are disrespecting and quite frankly, horribly treating librarians who are doing really good and courageous work, who put themselves out there by basically just making sure that we're standing up for a human right. And so I would encourage you to please take a look at these case studies. Probably the most notable one for all of us, because it hits home, is Smithtown Library in Long Island, where a board, and this was the case that I talked about earlier today, the board actually issued a request and required the library director to send out a memo to staff to remove all LGBTQIA displays from the children's section. And then there was a huge outpouring cry from not only just the Long Island community, but also all across New York State and advocates from across the nation. And fortunately, to the credit of that board, they have reversed their decision. And so those displays now stand within the children's section of the Smithtown Library. Okay. So let's get into the specific stuff. We've got the essential tools that we talked about early on in the presentation. And so we just kind of want to talk about them a little bit more in detail in terms of defining the policy and then the policy's purpose. What I'd like to do is I talked quite a bit about the collection management policy, as well as the challenge to library materials and request for reconsideration form. Because some of the specific stuff that we've been dealing with in our system revolves around community members' communication with or at frontline staff working in libraries. Erika, I'm going to actually ask you to take the lead on talking about social media and public communications policies first, and then with whatever time we have left, we'll get into the other policies, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Brian. So for each of you at your libraries, it would be a great tool to have in place both a social media and a public communications policy. And you could even have a public communications policy with a social media policy as a subset. But having both of those in place will give you a tool to turn toward when you do receive harassing comments or inappropriate comments on social media or emails that are threatening and harassing for staff or volunteers or even complaints at the desk. It'll give you a place to start. So starting with the social media policy, you want to use that to outline staff who, one, have administrative access to your accounts, who's responsible for creating content, what is the scope of that content supposed to look like, and then who's responsible for responding to comments and messages that come in through social media. And that policy should clearly state what acceptable behavior looks like in social media. So just like you have policies that tell patrons what acceptable behavior in the library looks like, you certainly can't govern their behavior across social media, but when they are interacting with library posts, you can outline what that acceptable behavior looks like in your social media policy, and then post it to your website so it's available. Folks can become familiar with it if they choose to. And the great thing about having that policy in place is that when you do receive an alarming comment on social media, this happens to me about once a week now with STLS social media, I don't have to panic anymore because I have a tool that I know, one, Brian has seen, our board has seen, they looked at the policy, they've approved the policy, so I know they stand behind me. And then our policy clearly defines for me what comments or messages, but primarily it's comments that I don't want people to see and then pile on and for it to just become a garbage fire, right? So the policy outlines for me clearly what is not acceptable and then what my recourse is for that and how I can respond or just remove the comment to prevent it from exploding on social media, because we know that can happen quite easily. And with the when we talk about a larger communications policy, that can be helpful for other forms of communication, right, that you're receiving from the public. And I think it's especially important because it allows you to set guidelines for all kinds of like these other virtual spaces that we maybe don't think about. So there was a session earlier today where we talked about using Discord for like chatting with patrons and then also using it for programming like book clubs. I love that idea. I think it's a great platform to explore. But when we talk about things like Discord and Twitch and Zoom, you want to make sure that you have a policy that applies to those virtual spaces because you want your patrons to feel safe interacting in those spaces with you, and you don't want bad actors to come in and either Zoom bomb or just be inappropriate or put up inappropriate images, or even in the chats within those different platforms to drop in like offensive content, right? You want to have a recourse to get them removed from the space, and you can certainly remove them without having a policy behind you, but it's better that you do have a policy to lean on, and then it's not on you. You can remove the blame from yourself and point to that policy. You know, your board and director, if you're not the director, are behind you because you've reviewed the policy with them. It's been approved. It gives you something to stand by, and then also deflects the anger that you might encounter from the individual a little bit, maybe. And other things you might include in that communications policy could include, like if you have a photo form, a photo permission release form. So if you're taking photos of individuals at programs, you might have something that's either for children or for everyone, for parents to sign saying, hey, it's okay to take a picture of my child. You could include guidelines for what that looks like, and then also include the form in your communications policy. And then you should also identify different roles that folks will play within the library. So who is the spokesperson for the library? Is it strictly the director? If somebody calls with looking for a comment about a controversial program that you're offering, do you want your frontline staff providing that comment, or should they be directing that person to your director? Who is the ultimate person that's responsible for being the spokesperson? And in the same vein, who is handling public relations and really responsible for the public image of the library? And that could be a few people on staff, but just identifying the various roles that folks will play. And then keeping track too of what newspapers you use for press releases and things like that can be a useful thing to outline in this as well. Brian, I think that pretty much covers the bones of it, noticing that we're closing in on time.
Yeah, I know. That's what happens when I talk. So the one thing that I'll share, and Erika does a really good job of highlighting, like not only like what should be in that social media policy, but also like the why behind it. But it's more of the nuts and bolts in terms of like the day to day, and allowing you to take some emotion off the table when those concerns, or like when that harassing or that bullying or that trolling takes place, where you can take that emotion off the table, and depending upon your library's unique situation and who's in charge of those communications, whether it's through email or through its social media, like just dealing with it in that very moment. The other thing that I think is really important, because and just not to like keep going on about it, but like Eric and I, before we had a social media policy, and STLS is really amping up in terms of how we were doing social media, we had multiple situations where like Eric and I were going back and forth through like our messaging system or email or phone calls just to try to figure out how to deal with it. And like we don't do that anymore. Like it's just like the policy is board driven, board approved, board reviewed, and they support us on it and they trust us to implement it. And so and we don't have to have those conversations because Eric has been given very concrete guidelines on how to deal with it. But quite honestly, those guidelines were driven by her. Like she's the one that uses that platform. She knows how to respond best. And it was her recommendations and the creation of that policy that allowed me and the board to support her in that work. The other thing that I would quickly share about the public communications policy is knowing, having something in that policy that tells you how and when to respond or when not to respond. There are times when people are going to say things or submit things that don't deserve any type of response whatsoever. For the health and well-being, not only of the individual that received those inquiries, but also for the health and well-being of the organization. And so, that's really the importance of having a public communications policy as well as a social media policy. I know that we're running near the end of our session, but I did cover collection management policy pretty much in depth when we were doing our overview, as well as the request for reconsideration of library materials policy and the request for reconsideration of library materials form. We are going to have handouts of all of these tools. So all the essential tools we'll share with you after today's session. So you'll have the templates in hand in Word document so that you can save them to your hard drive and you can edit them and you can make them available to your library and your library's policy manual. You can work with, for directors, you can work with your trustees on them and edit them in the way that you feel meets the best needs of your library. And then once those are set, you can work with your staff and your volunteers to make sure everybody is well trained and informed on how to handle these situations. So we are almost out of time, and I apologize, we did not leave a lot of time for questions, but we'll take some time for questions. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask us? And I guess the good thing is even though we're getting off the call shortly, Eric and I aren't going anywhere, so we can help after the session as well. Okay. Oh, we do got chat. Oh, thank you, Linda. Well, so thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I know we're going to end this session now so that we can go into the wrap up and goodbye session, which starts at 3:30. So we don't want to be late. We want to meet the rest of the folks there, but you know how to get in touch with us. You know our email contacts. Please reach out to us. And like I said, you'll get those key documents after today's session. we appreciate all of you, and we appreciate all that you do. And until we see each other again, thanks everybody.